From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Donald Trump shows more of his hand on how he plans to settle the Ukraine-Russia war, and he's starting by putting more pressure on Ukraine than he is on Russia. What is Trump's strategy, and how is it playing in the United States, Russia, Ukraine, and the rest of Europe? That's our subject for today on Potomac Watch. I'm Paul Gigot, the editor of the Wall Street Journal Opinion pages, and this is our daily podcast. And I'm here with my colleagues and Ukraine war watchers, Bill McGurn and Kate Batchelder-Odell. Welcome to you both. So last week, Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, said Ukraine will not be able to join NATO. That was walked back somewhat by the administration a couple days later, but Trump then said, yeah, that was probably right. And Hegseth said it was also not realistic for Ukraine to return to its pre-2014 borders. That's when Russia first invaded Ukraine. Then Donald Trump disclosed he had a phone call with Vladimir Putin and that they had agreed to send advisors to Saudi Arabia for meetings to talk about beginning a peace process for the war. Ukraine was not invited. The rest of Europe not invited. And that meeting took place on Tuesday, where some opening parameters were laid out for the future talks on a settlement. But Ukraine, again, not sure if they're going to even have a say, much less be at the table. So then Trump said the following when he was asked about the meeting on Tuesday. Let's listen.
And I think I have the power to end this war. And I think it's going very well. But today I heard, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
All right. That invited a reaction from Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, because the suggestion that somehow Ukraine had started the war and somehow had failed to settle it along the way, as if Vladimir Putin would have agreed to any settlement. And Zelensky said that Trump was operating in what he called a disinformation space. That didn't sit well with the American president, who punched back later on Wednesday with these remarks.
A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast, or he's not going to have a country left. Got to move fast, because that war is going in the wrong direction. In the meantime, we're successfully negotiating an end to the war with Russia. Something all admit that only Trump is going to be able to do in the Trump administration. We're going to be able to do it. I think Putin even admitted that. Biden never tried. Europe has failed to bring peace, and Zelensky probably wants to keep the gravy train going. I don't know what's the problem, but he hasn't been able. He's very upset that he wasn't invited. He could have come if he wanted to, but that he wasn't invited to Saudi Arabia. But he's been working for 3 years. There's never been even meetings or phone calls to stop this war. It's a horrible thing.
Zelensky was invited, but he could have come, but he wasn't invited. I can't quite figure out that one. But Bill, what's your reaction to all of this? What do you think Trump is doing?
Well, we've moved very far from the election. Everyone knows Donald Trump campaigned on the idea that he's the man to get a deal to end the war in Ukraine, that he can deal with Putin and stuff. This has moved it to another level. We had confusing statements by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, then a little pushback from J.D. Vance. But now we see Donald Trump saying that President Zelensky of Ukraine started the war, that he's the aggressor, and that he better shut up and just take what Trump is offering him. It's really a tragedy. I think in Trump's mind, Ukraine is a democratic cause, meaning Biden supported it. The support for Ukraine was purely democratic by his enemies.
You mean Democratic Party of the U.S.?
Yeah. And therefore, Zelensky is just a front for the latest anti-Trump thing. Zelensky hasn't helped himself with a few comments pushing back on Trump. He's not in the position to do it. He made some foolish appearances with Biden during the election, but this is a man fighting for his country, so I give him wide slack. And factually, just to say that he started the war is so wrong. I don't know where to start. I mean, it's hard to imagine another Republican president in history, whether regarding Czechoslovakia, Taiwan via Quemoy-Matsoy, or Kuwait, who would stand by and call the aggressor the peace guy and the victim the aggressor. It goes against everything. And I think it's just because he sees it as unfriendly to him.
Kate, my view on Trump here is that in these remarks are actually, they're not an accident. They are not just something that popped into his head. He's saying this with calculation. He's trying to send a message to Zelensky and the Ukrainian people that you must accept whatever we decide, that is, whatever Russia and we decide, because the implicit threat is you can't survive without us. And he's also trying to send a message to the American public that, look, Zelensky is no secular saint here. Ukraine is not really a good cause. It's essentially morally equivalent with Russia. It's not a democracy, and therefore it's not really a cause that we have to expend all that much to defend. And that's why we're going to end the war. And he promised in the campaign, as Bill said, he's going to do it. There's no doubt in my mind, and you may agree or disagree, but there's no doubt in my mind about where Trump wants to head, what he wants to accomplish. I think the big question remaining is, what are the terms of any deal, and what does that do to Ukraine and Western security?
There's no question he's softening the ground for a bad deal. I think that voters were quite reasonably frustrated with the way Biden was prosecuting the war in Ukraine. I think they're not saying much by suggesting 2014 borders are not realistic at this point. I think in retrospect, a real pivotal turning point of the war was the winter of 2022, when the Russians dug fortifications and the Biden administration moved very slowly and very cautiously to arm Ukraine and capitalize on some of the momentum they developed in the early war.
This was after about a year of the war, Kate, or 10 months, right? They had the big offensive, took back ground, Ukraine did, in the Kherson district, and then tried to mobilize for another offensive, and Biden didn't give them the weapons they need. That's just to clarify the chronology.
Right. And what I'm driving at is that this is a mess that Biden left, and you can grant that point. But I think when voters elected Trump on the grounds that he would get a good deal that was favorable to the United States, I don't think that's what we're heading for. I think we're softening the ground for a deal that is essentially a surrender. We haven't figured out anything Putin is going to concede so far. 2014 borders, maybe those are out of the question, obviously, at this point. But what territory of the 20% of the country that he's currently occupying is he willing to give up to end the war? A deal that simply ratifies what he has taken with no guarantee for Ukraine so that they have future security is not going to be a deal that favors the United States, is one that will allow Putin a pause that at this point he needs. He has exhausted a lot of material and personnel. He doesn't want to do another round of mobilization. He's trying to play the Trump administration for sanctions relief. And so what it is shaping up to look like is a pause that will allow Putin to restart the war on his own terms. And the question is, what credible deterrent is the United States going to enforce from that happening? And that is, I think, that $1 trillion question that we don't have an answer to yet. And we're hearing about things that are not very credible, like European peacekeeping forces with no United States assistance or backing.
Yeah, we can talk about that a little later, elaborate on that. But we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about the issue of security guarantees for Ukraine as part of a deal when we come back. Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot here on Potomac Watch, the daily podcast of the Wall Street Journal opinion pages. And I'm here with Bill McGurn and Kate Batchelder-Odell. Just a couple of other data points that have popped up here in the last day, including on Thursday. Michael Waltz, the president of the United States National Security Advisor, went on Fox News and said that Zelensky should tone down his criticism of the negotiations and sign that deal, quote unquote. Of course, the question is, well, what deal? There is not a deal yet. There's only the intimations of what Trump and Russia might do, but no deal to sign. So basically, Waltz is saying, you'll take whatever we give you, and no guarantees that Ukraine will even be at the table. And then there's this news story, which coming out of Europe, clearly leaked by the Europeans, that the G7, which has traditionally issued statements of unity on Ukraine and Russia and the war, is on the third anniversary, which is approaching on February 22nd, wanted to issue a statement, and they're leaking that the United States opposes language that calls Russia the aggressor in the war, which is appalling as a historical matter, since it is the aggressor. It was the aggressor, continues to be the aggressor. And yet, if the administration is balking at that, it suggests that the U.S. is essentially appeasing Russia by trying to adopt some of their language here. And look, I mean, I'm all for peace in this conflict, but it's hard to get peace when you actually don't admit honestly what is happening, Bill.
Yeah, I think that's the problem. Look, Donald Trump's whole reputation is a negotiator. He's a guy that does deals. But in this negotiation, look, consider how he treated Hamas. He said, you guys violate the terms, get it done by this weekend, release the hostages, or all hell will break loose. So different from how he's doing it with Ukraine. He's giving away what I consider the store, NATO membership for Ukraine, getting them a seat at the table of Saudi Arabia, all these credible things that Ukraine would want, all the things that are most likely prevent Mr. Putin from further aggression. He's conceding them beforehand. And Kate mentioned about forcing a deal on Ukraine. There's a haunting conversation between Nixon and Kissinger in 1972, right before the Paris Peace Accords.
This is over Vietnam, Bill.
Over South Vietnam. And Nixon basically at one point says, I'm good with anything we can force down to throat, the president of South Vietnam. I think that's the same thing going on here. The difference is we had no troops in Vietnam, and I think the Ukrainians will fight no matter what. One last thing to emphasize Kate's point. We have rightly criticized Biden for giving the Ukrainians enough to prosecute the war, but not to prevail. And I think that's exactly right. But another thing that Biden could have done, he was for it, NATO membership for Ukraine. If he had just spent his administration pushing that, we would be in a far better position today than we are now. I don't understand most things with Trump. I can understand negotiating tactic. I don't understand the logic of these negotiations. I don't understand the idea that Zelensky is the enemy or the aggressor. And I think it just doesn't bode well for an agreement.
Bill, just to clarify on the Vietnam point, in 1972, the U.S. did have troops in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Unlike Ukraine, where we do not have troops, we're just supplying arms and advice. In Vietnam, we were trying to achieve what was called at the time peace with honor, a withdrawal from Vietnam of all U.S. forces, which we eventually negotiated. And 1973, the deal was struck, and it was called a just peace at the time, or believed, sold certainly by the Nixon administration, and all troops were gone. Yet within 2 years, the North Vietnamese had invaded and the South fell. It turned out it was not peace with honor. It was a disaster for the Vietnamese people.
Paul, one further point to that. In Vietnam, we withdrew the troops, and there were promises that if North continued its aggression, we would come to their aid. And Kissinger and Nixon also blamed Congress for pulling that aid at the end. And they had a point. Donald Trump won't have that excuse, because unless he includes that as a provision in the final deal, which it looks like he won't have the excuse. He's the one pulling aid.
And I think actually Nixon and Kissinger were right about the congressional role in pulling aid. That was the signal to the North Vietnamese. You can go for Saigon because the U.S. is not going to do anything about it. Kate, there is interesting reactions from the Republican senators who heretofore have supported Ukraine. Publicly, there is really a reluctance to criticize Trump's statements and his positions here. I mean, Lindsey Graham and others, John Thune, have said, well, I don't agree that Ukraine was the aggressor, but that's the president's comments, not mine. But Lindsey Graham, the South Carolina senator, said, I don't agree with that, but I do trust the president to get a good deal. And I think he will get a good deal. And that one hopes that they are privately talking to Trump and saying, you have to do some kind of security guarantee that's credible for Ukraine. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a circumstance where even if Putin says, oh, sure, I'll stop the war. You give me my current borders in Ukraine, and I'll stop, and you ease sanctions, release sanctions on us. We can start selling our natural gas to Europe again. You'll give us the frozen assets, more than $300 billion that you have. You give that back to us. That would certainly help economically. Be able to bide his time, rebuild his military, not have to do a major call-up of manpower, which he's losing a lot of men right now, which is why he's recruiting the North Koreans to come in as cannon fodder. And you give him, Putin, a year, 2, 3, whatever he feels he needs to build up force again, to go back and take another bite out of Ukraine. And that's, of course, what the Ukrainians so fear. And that's why they want credible security guarantees, which they want as membership in NATO. But even if you don't give them NATO, they might be able to live with something that is at least credible if there are some kind of foreign forces there and they can build up their defense industrial base. But there's no sure thing that that's what Trump is going to insist on when he's negotiating with Russia. And that's a real concern that I have.
That is a real concern. I think the reason you're seeing so much GOP reluctance to criticize him is because they're trying to influence his negotiations to the extent possible to get the best deal. If Trump's going to do a deal, we're going to try to shape it to be the best deal possible. One thing I just add about the consequences of a bad deal is that there seems to be a thinking that, Trump really wants to be done with this. He wants to settle it and move on to his other priorities. But not only will a bad settlement be politically costly, but it could set off a chain of events that he will have to deal with that he's not going to like. It could multiply his headaches in other parts of the world. What I'm talking about is here we have North Korea and Iran have both intervened in this conflict in material ways with troops from North Korea, with Iranian drones on the side of Russia. We know, as NATO has even said out loud, that China has been a major enabler of Russia's war with Ukraine in providing, even non-military equipment. So what happens and how this settlement is read by other adversaries will determine whether they, for instance, try other provocations in other parts of the world, on the Korean Peninsula, in the Pacific near Taiwan. I mean, the idea that we can settle this on poor terms and just forget about it, I think is really naive given the increasing coordination among the adversaries around the world. This isn't just a Ukraine issue. It is an axis of aggression that goes back to the Chinese Communist Party. So I just want to push back too, Joe Biden thought he could wash his hands of Afghanistan and move on and be a hero. But what ended up happening is he ended up being greeted with all sorts of problems elsewhere in the world, including Ukraine invasion, including the disorder in the Red Sea. And President Trump should worry that his presidency could take a similar turn.
Well, I certainly agree with that. And I guess if we were talking to the administration quietly, they would say, well, don't worry about it. We're going to get a deal that prevents all that. So, you have to hope that that is possible.